In this video, we'll build a first-person controller. This controller can be useful in any 3D environment that requires the ability to walk around, such as architectural walkthroughs, first-person games, or open environments. We're going to be implementing some basic collisions, gravity, and even make tweaks to the controller settings for a smooth moving controller. So let's get started. Here we are in Visual Studio Code. We're starting off in a class called First Person Controller. And in here we have some starter code. So the starter code for this class comes from the snippet prototype demo.ts. Again, that can be found in the snippets folder of Babylon examples. If you want to follow along with the same code that I'm using, you will find a link to the code repository in the description down below. If we take a quick look at the starter code, we just have a create scene, which allows us to create the scene and a hemispheric light. Note there is no camera in here because we are going to be creating that as part of the controller. We also have a create environment. All this is doing is importing the model called prototype_level.glb. You're also going to find that model in the models folder up here on the left. Okay, so the first person controller is going to allow us to walk around an environment. We want to be able to actually interact with the environment with collisions. So I don't want to be able to walk through a wall or any other mesh object. We're going to be using collisions with this. We're also going to be applying gravity and also going over how we can modify the inputs of this controller. At the very bottom of this class, let's get started by first adding in our camera. Right now, we have no way of seeing anything in our scene because the camera is the eyes of our scene. So with no camera, we can't see anything at all. So let's add in our camera first. I'll create a new method. We're going to say create controller. This is not going to return anything, so we'll set that to a return type of void. At the very top of this, it's add in a new camera. This will be a free camera based. So const, and I'm just going to call it camera. And this will be a new instance of the free camera. And let's just name it camera. For the position, I know I have a model at the center point of the world. It is quite large. It is a ramp. And because it's in the middle of our world, I want to make sure that we're starting off above the ground, above this ramp. So I'm going to set the position of the vector 3 a little bit higher along the y-axis. We're going to say new vector 3, and we're going to say 0 for the x, 10 for the y, and 0 for the z. Let's finally add it to our scene, and that's all we're going to do for now. So let's go ahead and call this. I'll do this right after we create the environment in the constructor. This.create controller. Okay, let's jump to the front end and let's see how this looks. Okay, now with our camera in place, I can now see the meshes. We are above the ground, so we only see part of this. I've also not attached control to the camera, so even if I left click in here, nothing is going to happen. This is purely a static camera at this point. Let's enable the control so we can actually move around in this environment. Okay, going back into the create controller, let's attach control. So I'm going to say camera.attach control. Let's save this. Okay, let's verify that this is working as intended. If I left click and hold, I can move left and right. So we've gone over how to do this before. I can use the arrow keys and you'll see that I'm flying around. Now, both of these mechanics I want to modify. We are working with a first person controller. And while this is working in a first person manner, I don't want to have to left click and hold just to look around. If I was building this in a game or some sort of demo that requires me to left click on objects to interact with them, that mechanic is now being used for both this and also interacting with our environment. So there may be some sort of conflict there. I also want to adjust being able to be on the ground. I don't want to be flying around my scene. If this was an architectural demo, I don't want to fly around the house. I want to walk around the house as if I'm actually there. So we need to place our object, our character, on the ground, the first person controller I'm talking about. We're going to place that on the ground. And then also, I don't want to be able to go through these objects like that. Now we are going to be modifying these things step by step. So the first thing we're going to take a look at is the movement of our mouse. So when I move left and right with my mouse, I want to be able to control the movement of the camera without having to left click. So that's the first thing we're going to take a look at. Okay, going back into our code, let's go back into our create scene method. What we want to do now is use something called the pointer lock. This will allow me to lock my pointer to the center of the screen, and then I can move left and right just by moving my mouse around. Now this will hide my cursor, but we can also retrieve that cursor once again if we press escape, but I'll also show you a different way of retrieving that cursor using a custom mouse button. So let's go down into our create scene method. Let's implement that. To implement that, we're going to be using the on pointer down of the scene. So scene.on pointer down. And this takes in an event, so we can say EVT for short. And with this, we can check to see whether or not we're pressing a specific mouse button. These are going to be based off numbers. So we're going to have 0, 1, and 2. 0 is going to be left click. 1 is going to be the middle mouse button. And then finally, the 2 is going to be the right click of our mouse. We're just going to be using the left click and the middle mouse button. So let's check to see if EVT.button, and we're checking for a number. So I'm going to type in 0. I'm checking to see if we press left click. Now, if we did press left click, then we want to use this.engine.pointer and look for enter pointer lock. So we have exit and enter. We're going to use both of these, but we want to enter the pointer lock. And then if evt.button, if I want to use a separate button for unlocking or getting out of the pointer lock, I could say if I press 1, that'll be the middle mouse button. Then I'll do the opposite of that. So this.engine.exit pointer lock. Okay, let's give that a quick try and see how that works. Okay, now if I left click anywhere in here, we go into the on pointer lock. I can look around just by moving my mouse around. To get out of this mode, either hit escape, there we go, or I can also use my middle mouse button. Okay, now let's take a look at how we can implement collisions and gravity. Okay, going back into our create scene method, let's add in the gravity and the collisions. I'm going to do this right below where we created the on pointer down. We're going to create a couple of new variables, one for the FPS or the frames per second. We're also going to be applying a gravity value as well. So both of these are going to be used with the scene gravity. So I'm going to have a variable in here called frames per second. And we'll set that equal to 60. This can be higher if you want it to be. And the reason why we're using frames per second is because we want to have a very smooth, controlled descent in terms of the gravity. So by using the frames per second, we can control that. Next, we're going to add in the actual gravity value. I'll call it gravity. The typical value that people use for gravity on Earth is negative 9.81. Next, let's add this to the scene gravity. So scene.gravity. And scene.gravity is a vector 3 if I hover over it. And we're going to use the frames per second and the gravity together as the y-axis for this. So new vector 3, we're going to say 0 for the x. And then for the frames per second and the gravity, we're going to divide the gravity over the frames per second. Next, we're then going to add in 0 for the z-axis. And there we go. So we're only applying gravity along the y-axis. And we're taking the gravity value here and we're dividing that by the frames per second. This will give us a nice smooth motion for the gravity along the y-axis there. Okay, so we have our gravity. Now let's add in the collisions. So scene dot, let's look for collisions. And you can see we have collisions enabled. This is a Boolean, so we'll set that to true. Okay, so we've implemented the gravity and the collisions enabled, but now we need to actually create collisions. So we need something to actually collide with. So we're going to do that with our environment down below. We've already enabled the collisions and the gravity. We're going to use the gravity with our camera controller and the collisions with both the meshes and our controller as well. Let's start off with the meshes first. So for the meshes, what I want to do is I want to apply collisions to everything that's in this model. So the easiest way to do this is to say meshes.map. And I'm going to map through and I'm going to say for every mesh in here, I want to check collisions. So mesh.check collisions. And this is a Boolean as well. So we're going to set that to true. And now all of our meshes have collisions, or rather they can check for collisions. Okay, let's go down into the create controller now. We're going to add in gravity and we're also going to be checking for collisions with that as well. So with the camera, we're going to be applying gravity. So camera.apply gravity. This is a Boolean. Again, if I hover over this, you can see it says Boolean. And then we also need to check for collisions. So the way that we would do this is the same as how we would do this with a mesh. So camera.check collisions. Again, another Boolean. Okay, so we've applied gravity and collisions, but none of these will work unless we have some sort of way of detecting the camera. So the way that we detect the camera is by creating an ellipsoid. The ellipsoid you can kind of think of as the body for this camera. So camera.ellipsoid, and the ellipsoid is a vector 3. So we provide the x, y, and z values for essentially the scale of this ellipsoid. So I'll set this to a new vector 3. And we're going to set it equal to 1, 1, and 1 for the x, y, and z. Okay, so with all that done, now we have everything that we need to test this out. So we have gravity and collisions on the controller, the camera, and we also have collisions on the meshes. And then we've also applied the gravity and the collisions for the entire scene. Let's go ahead and test this out now. Okay, left click in here, I can look around. Now you'll notice that I don't actually fall to the ground. Once I start moving, I should be able to actually interact with the environment, okay? So you can see I didn't fall through the ground. I can go up the ramp. You can see I can move around very, very quickly right now. But you can see I don't go through anything. There is going to be a few issues we still need to address. So one of them is that I can get in very close to this object here. And you can see we start to get some clipping. So if I take a look at the ramp here, I can take a look inside. And that's not really ideal. Okay, so we need to address that. The other thing is, you'll see that I basically just fly around super, super quick. I don't want to be able to move this quick in my environment. Imagine if this was an architectural walkthrough or something of that sort. You don't want to be moving around this fast. You want to move at a walking pace. So we're going to be adjusting the speed of the camera, and we're also going to be adjusting the clipping issue that we have there. Let's also adjust the way that we move around with our camera. So right now, this is actually very, very fast. It's almost disorientating. So you can see I can move left and right, up and down, and it's very, very quick. So we need to adjust the sensibility of the camera as well. The angular sensibility will control the rotation speed here. Let's go back into our code. Let's make some modifications. Okay, going back into our create controller. To adjust the clipping issue, we need to modify the minimum Z. This is something that we covered before, but the minimum Z is the near clipping plane of the camera. So camera.minZ. And we can set this to a value of say 0.45. This will allow us to get in very close to the object, but we don't actually clip through it. Let's also adjust the speed. So camera.speed. And I'll set that to 0. Let's go with 7.5 for now. We can modify that further if need be. And then for the angular sensibility, this is essentially the rotation speed of that camera. We're going to say camera.angularSensibility. And if I hover over this, you can see that the default is 2000. So a higher value is going to slow that down. Let's bump this up to a value of 4000 instead. Okay, so now if we take a look around, you can see it's a lot smoother, a lot slower. Let's interact with our environment so I can walk around. And you can see it's much, much slower. Now, it's still a little bit fast, especially if you're using this for walking around a house or something of that sort. This is not really walking speed. This is almost running speed, but it's a lot slower. And you can modify that speed further if you want to. I'm going to keep mine the way it is. Okay, now there is one last thing that we need to take a look at, and that is the camera inputs. Right now, I'm using the arrow keys on my keyboard to navigate around in this environment. These arrow keys are not really ideal for me. I prefer to use the WASD keys instead. Let's take a look at how we can implement those kind of inputs with our camera. Okay, before we take a look at the code, let's take a look at this website called keycode.info. We are going to be using different key codes for the code that we're going to be using for the inputs. And this is a great way to determine which key codes you need to use. We are going to be using the WASD keys on my keyboard. And this website, keycode.info, allows you to very easily find the various key codes that you would want to use. So if I press W on my keyboard, you can see it says 87, S is 83, A is 65, and then D is 68. Now don't worry, you don't have to memorize those. I will be providing them in the code, but I did want to go over how you can find those key codes very easily using this website. Okay, so let's jump back into our code and start implementing our new inputs. Going back into the create controller right at the very bottom and start implementing our new inputs. So I'm going to do these in order of WASD. So let's start off by saying camera.keys up, and keys up is basically forward. And this is an array, so we're going to push into that. And what we're going to be pushing in there is the key code. So for W, that's going to be 87. Next, we're going to have the left key. So camera.keys left dot push, and that key code is going to be 65. Okay, so we have the up key, that's WASD. So 87, 65, 83, and 68. Okay, let's test out these new inputs. Okay, so if I use the WASD keys, I can now navigate around just like I did before, but now I can use the WASD keys, and I can still also use the arrow keys if I really wanted to use those as well. So now we have both options available to us. So there you have it, a very simple and easy way to implement a first-person controller. You can use this controller for any kind of walkthroughs or anything of that sort where you want to walk around in an environment. This is a great first-person controller to use that with.